History remembers kings with their swords and crowns, their battles etched into legend. But what about the queens who wielded just as much power, often with even greater cunning? Behind the grand tapestries of medieval Europe and beyond, there were women who didn't just sit on thrones, they stormed onto battlefields, outmaneuvered rivals, and commanded armies with a fierceness that defied their era's expectations. These were warrior queens, rulers who shattered the limits placed on them, yet their stories have been whispered where others shouted. Why? Because history, written by the victors, often overlooked the women who fought just as hard, sometimes harder, to protect their people and their power. Picture this, a queen armored not just in steel but in unbreakable resolve, galloping at the head of her troops, her banner flying high. She isn't a myth or a character from legend, she's real, one of dozens whose names have been buried under the weight of time. Some led charges that turned the tide of wars, others outwitted empires through diplomacy and sheer will. Their strategies were as sharp as any blade, their courage as unyielding as castle walls. Yet, when we think of medieval warriors, why do their faces so rarely come to mind? This video is a reckoning with those forgotten legacies. We're unearthing 26 of history's most formidable medieval queens, women who ruled, fought, and sometimes bled for their kingdoms. Their tales are woven with triumph and tragedy, betrayal and brilliance. You'll meet queens who defended their lands against overwhelming odds, who negotiated peace when war failed, and who, in some cases, rewrote the rules of power entirely. By the time we're done, you'll see the Middle Ages not as a parade of kings, but as an era where queens stood shoulder to shoulder with them, and often ahead of them. So let's begin where their stories did, not in the shadows, but in the light they fought so fiercely to claim. The medieval world was a chessboard of shifting power, where kingdoms rose and fell on the edge of a sword, but the game wasn't just played by kings. While chroniclers of the time often painted women as passive figures, bound by the loom and the chapel, reality was far more thrilling. Imagine a Europe where borders blurred like ink on wet parchment, where a single death or marriage could redraw the map overnight. In this volatile landscape, a handful of women refused to be pawns. They became players, wielding influence through alliances forged in war rooms as often as in wedding chapels. Take inheritance, for example, a fragile thread that could snap under pressure. When a king died without sons, his daughter might suddenly find herself the key to a kingdom's survival. But claiming that throne, that required steel nerves, rivals would circle like wolves, questioning her right to rule, whispering that a woman's hands were too soft to hold a scepter. Yet some queens silenced those whispers by gripping the reins of power tighter than any man dared. Others exploited the chaos of crusades or civil wars to carve out their own authority, proving that in times of upheaval, brilliance mattered more than gender. Religion, too, shaped their struggles. The church preached obedience, yet warrior queens navigated its contradictions with shrewdness. Some wielded piety as a shield, using their devotion to justify their rule. Others bent religious doctrine to their will, funding abbeys or patronizing saints who bolstered their legitimacy. And let's not forget the sheer physicality of their reigns. These women didn't just rule from cushioned chairs. They rode through mud and snow to inspect fortifications, endured sieges with their soldiers, and in some cases strapped on armor themselves. Why then did so many of their stories fade? The answer lies in the quills of medieval scribes, most of them monks who saw the world through a lens of divine order, a woman leading armies that disrupted the narrative. So they minimized her victories, attributed her cunning to feminine wiles, or erased her altogether. but the cracks in their parchment betray the truth. Receipts for armies paid, treaties signed in a queen's name, the panicked letters of enemies who underestimated her. These fragments, scattered across centuries, are how we finally piece together the full picture, not of exceptions to history, but of women who shaped it. Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, wasn't just a footnote in her father's legend. She was the architect of her own. Born to Alfred the Great, she grew up in a world where Viking raids were constant threats, where kingdoms crumbled under the weight of invasion. But where others saw ruin, Æthelflæd saw opportunity. When her husband, the ruler of Mercia, passed away, she didn't step aside for a male successor. Instead, she took the reins herself, ruling with a combination of military genius and political savvy that left even her fiercest rivals in awe. Her first challenge. A landscape littered with Viking strongholds. While her father had pushed back the invaders in Wessex, the north remained volatile. Æthelflæd didn't wait for the enemy to strike. She launched a campaign of fortress building, constructing a network of fortified towns that became the backbone of English resistance. These weren't just defensive structures, they were strategic masterpieces, placed at key river crossings and trade routes to choke Viking supply line. One by one, she reclaimed territory, not through brute force alone, but through careful planning and relentless determination. But her brilliance extended beyond the battlefield. Æthelflæd understood the power of alliances. She negotiated with Welsh kings, secured loyalty from regional lords, and even brokered deals with rival Anglo-Saxon rulers to present a united front. In an era where trust was fragile, she built coalitions that held firm under pressure, and when diplomacy failed, she led from the front. Chroniclers recorded her presence at sieges, directing troops with the same authority as any king. Yet for all her achievements, Æthelflæd's name isn't as familiar as it should be. Part of the reason lies in the way history was recorded. Medieval scribes, often monks, struggled to reconcile a woman's military success with their worldview. They praised her, yes, but as an exception, not a precedent. And when her brother Edward took control of Mercia after her death, her legacy was quietly absorbed into his reign. But the evidence remains, charters signed in her name, towns that still bear the marks of her fortifications, and the simple fact that under her rule, Mercia didn't just survive, it thrived. Her story forces us to rethink the medieval world. Æthelflæd wasn't an anomaly. She was proof that when given the chance, women could wield power as decisively as any man. And she wasn't alone. Across Europe, others like her were rewriting the rules, their stories waiting to be uncovered. While Æthelflæd defended England from Viking invasions far to the east, another queen was carving her name into history with equal brilliance. Tamar of Georgia didn't just inherit a crown. She reshaped an entire kingdom in her image, turning a small Christian state into an empire that dazzled the medieval world. Imagine a woman so formidable that poets called her king instead of queen, not as an insult but out of sheer respect. This was no symbolic ruler. Tamar led armies, dictated laws, and outmaneuvered rivals who thought her gender made her weak. Her rise to power was anything but smooth. When her father declared her co-ruler, nobles balked. A woman on the throne, unthinkable. They demanded she marry to give Georgia a proper king. Tamar played along at first, wedding a Russian prince, then swiftly had him exiled when he tried to seize control. Her next move was masterful. She chose her own husband, a man loyal to her vision, and together they crushed the rebellions that followed. This wasn't just survival, it was a lesson in turning opposition into opportunity. Under Tamar, Georgia didn't just hold its ground, it exploded outward. She launched military campaigns that stretched her borders from the Black Sea to the Caucasus Mountains, defeating powerful Muslim empires that had long threatened her realm. But Tamar knew conquest wasn't enough. She poured wealth into churches and monasteries, not just as acts of faith, but as political statements. These towering stone cathedrals, adorned with frescoes of her reign, became symbols of Georgia's golden age, a direct challenge to anyone who doubted her divine right to rule. What's most astonishing is how she wielded soft power. While medieval Europe often reduced queens to marriage alliances, Tamar flipped the script. She became the patron saints artists and scholars clamored to please, her court a beacon of culture. The epic poem, The Knight in the Panther's Skin, commissioned under her reign, wasn't just literature, it was propaganda painting her as the ideal sovereign, wise, just, and unshakable. Yet for all her achievements, Tamar remains a shadow in Western histories. Perhaps it's because Georgia sat at the crossroads of empires, its stories lost in the clash between East and West. Or maybe her success was too uncomfortable a reminder that women didn't just rule, they excelled at it. Even now, in the hills of Georgia, you'll find her face on coins and her name in folk songs. The queen who refused to be erased, Matilda of Tuscany, didn't just defend the Pope. She reshaped the balance of power in medieval Europe with a grip as firm as the stone walls of her fortresses. In an era where emperors and popes clashed over who held ultimate authority, Matilda stood at the center of the storm, a woman whose strategic mind and unyielding resolve made her the linchpin of the investiture controversy. Picture this: while kings and bishops debated theology, she raised armies, fortified castles, and outmaneuvered Emperor Henry Roman IV himself, not once but twice. Her story isn't just about faith or warfare. It's about how one woman's defiance rewrote the rules of influence. Born into the powerful house of Canossa, Matilda inherited vast lands stretching across northern Italy, a territory so strategically vital that controlling it meant controlling the heart of Europe. But titles alone didn't secure her power. When Henry Roman IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, sought to appoint his own bishops, undermining the Pope's authority, Matilda chose her side with unwavering conviction. She didn't just offer the papacy moral support, she became its sword and shield. Her mountain fortresses, like Canossa, became impenetrable strongholds where even emperors found themselves humbled. It was here, in the dead of winter, that Henry Roman IV famously stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging Pope Gregory Roman VII for forgiveness, a moment orchestrated by Matilda's political cunning. Yet her genius wasn't limited to defense. Matilda commanded troops in open battle, a rarity for women of her time. Chroniclers recorded her leading cavalry charges, her presence on the battlefield galvanizing soldiers who might otherwise have hesitated to follow a woman. She understood the power of symbolism too. By donating vast estates to the church, she cemented her reputation as piety incarnate, a shrewd move that insulated her from critics who might question a woman wielding such authority. But history hasn't been kind to her legacy. Later accounts reduced her to a devout noblewoman, glossing over her military acumen. Even Dante, who placed her in paradise in his Divine Comedy, painted her as an almost ethereal figure, ignoring the grit that defined her life. The truth, Matilda was a master of realpolitik long before the term existed. She navigated betrayals, survived sieges, and brokered alliances with a clarity that left her male counterpart scrambling. Her loyalty to the papacy wasn't blind faith, it was a calculated choice that kept her enemies in check and her lands secure. What makes her story so compelling is the duality she embodied. Matilda prayed like a saint but ruled like a warlord, proving that piety and power weren't contradictions but tools to be wielded together. In a world that demanded women choose between devotion and dominance, she refused the dichotomy, and in doing so, became the most formidable ally the medieval church ever had. Olga of Leon and Castile stepped onto a throne drenched in chaos, her crown more a target than a prize. 12th century Spain was a chessboard of warring Christian kingdoms and advancing Muslim caliphates, where power shifted with the treachery of the hour. When her father Alfonso VI died, Olga didn't inherit a realm. She inherited a web of conspiracies. Nobles saw her as a puppet. Her ex-husband, Alfonso of Aragon, viewed her lands as his rightful spoils. Even her own sister schemed to unseat her. Yet Olga didn't just endure, she fought back with a political acumen that should have etched her name among history's great rulers. Instead, chroniclers branded her reign as troubled, reducing her survival to scandal rather than strategy. What made her rule so volatile? Start with the marriage her father forced upon her to Alfonso of Aragon, a man whose ambition outstripped any loyalty. When Olga became queen in her own right, he demanded control, sparking a civil war that split the kingdom. But here's where her genius flickers through the historical muddle. She turned the church against him. By painting Alfonso as a tyrant who violated sacred oaths, she convinced bishops to annul their marriage, stripping him of legitimacy. This wasn't just personal, it was tactical. With the clergy on her side, she isolated her enemies while rallying townsfolk and lower nobles who saw her as a defender against aristocratic greed. Then came the battlefield. Olga didn't lead charges like Tamar of Georgia, but she financed armies, brokered mercenary contracts, and chose her generals with razor-sharp judgment. When her half-sister Teresa of Portugal allied with Alfonso, Olga didn't hesitate. She besieged Teresa's castles, not just to reclaim land, but to send a message: kinship wouldn't shield traitors. Later, facing revolt in Galicia, she crushed the rebellion without mercy, proving she could wield violence as coldly as any king. Yet the greatest testament to her skill lies in what she built amidst the chaos. Olga stabilized Leon's currency, patronized scholars to draft legal codes, and negotiated treaties with Muslim rulers that kept borders secure. These weren't the acts of a troubled ruler. They were the marks of a pragmatist who understood that real power required more than swords. So why is she remembered as a footnote? The answer whispers through the biases of medieval scribes. A woman embroiled in conflict, she must be emotional, reckless. Never mind that her male contemporaries waged wars over slights far pettier. Olga's true legacy is this: in an age where queenship was a tightrope over a pit of knives, she didn't just walk it, she rewired the ropes. Joan of Navarre proves that sometimes the quietest warriors leave the loudest echoes if you know where to listen. Long before her more famous namesake, Joan of Arc took up arms for France. This lesser-known Joan was defending her own kingdom with equal ferocity. Ruling the tiny Pyrenean realm of Navarre in the 14th century, she faced a threat far greater than her borders, the expanding might of France. But Joan didn't cower or concede. She raised an army, rallied her people, and personally took to the field, not as a figurehead but as a strategist. Her battles weren't just fought with swords. They were won with treaties, marriages, and an uncanny ability to turn enemies into allies. What makes her story so remarkable is the sheer improbability of her success. Navarre was a speck on the map compared to France's sprawling territories, yet Joan outmaneuvered kings and dukes with the precision of a chess master. When French forces encroached on her lands, she didn't just repel them, she orchestrated a campaign that forced France to the negotiating table. Then came her masterstroke, marrying into the French royal family, not as a subordinate but as a sovereign equal. This wasn't surrender, it was a calculated move that secured Navarre's independence for generations. Yet history barely whispers her name. Why? Because Joan's brilliance lay in the shadows. She didn't seek the spotlight like Joan of Arc, whose dramatic martyrdom cemented her legend. Instead, this Joan worked behind the scenes, her victories written in ink rather than blood. Chronicles of the time mention her in passing, as if ruling wisely was less noteworthy than ruling loudly. Even her armor, if she ever wore it, was metaphorical, the armor of patience, the armor of foresight. Her legacy forces us to ask, what makes a warrior? Is it the clash of steel or the quiet signing of a treaty that spares thousands from battle? Joan of Navarre chose the latter, and in doing so, she redefined strength. While other queens rode into war with banners unfurled, she wielded influence like a dagger, precise, subtle, and devastatingly effective. The tragedy isn't that she was forgotten. It's that we've forgotten how to recognize her kind of courage. Isabella of Castile rode into history wearing two masks, one of pious devotion, the other of unflinching steel. While schoolbooks remember her as the queen who funded Columbus, they often omit the woman who personally led sieges, clad in armor beneath her royal banners. Her conquest of Granada wasn't a distant command issued from a cushioned throne. It was a year-long spectacle of her riding through campfires, inspecting trenches, and rallying troops under Moorish arrows. This was no symbolic presence. Isabella calculated supply lines, commissioned Europe's most advanced artillery train, and starved the city into surrender through sheer strategic patience. Yet for all her battlefield brilliance, history prefers to paint her kneeling in prayer rather than standing atop a conquered fortress. Why? Because her duality unsettles the tidy narratives we prefer about medieval women. Take Granada's fall in 1492. The moment crystallizes her contradictions. As the last Muslim stronghold in Spain crumbled, Isabella entered the Alhambra not as a vengeful conqueror, but as a queen who'd negotiated surrender terms protecting the vanquished, only to later enforce the Alhambra decree expelling Jews who refused conversion. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was pragmatism forged in the fires of her youth. When she claimed Castile's crown at 23, half her nobility backed a rival claimant. She learned early that mercy could be fatal. Yet her faith wasn't just political theater. She attended Mass daily, even during campaigns, and her confessor chronicled her genuine anguish over ordering executions. That tension between ruthlessness and remorse makes her legacy so compelling. Modern accounts often flatten her into either a fanatic or a feminist icon. The truth lies in the ledgers. Isabella didn't just fund Columbus, she haggled over his contract like a merchant, securing royal control over any discovered lands. She standardized Castilian currency, overhauled laws to curb noble power, and created Europe's first standing army innovations that outlasted her. Even her infamous Inquisition served a cold logic. Unifying Spain required erasing differences, whether religious or regional. Perhaps what unsettles historians most is how she weaponized femininity. While other warrior queens masculinized their image, Isabella leaned into hers. She sewed banners for troops with her own hands, blending domesticity with dominance. She bore 5 children while governing, proving fertility wasn't weakness. And when Ferdinand's generals grumbled about taking orders from a woman, she silenced them not with shouts but with ledgers, proof her strategies worked. The real Isabella wasn't just a sponsor or a conqueror. She was a paradox that medieval Europe couldn't categorize, and so we've spent centuries trying to simplify her. But the stones of Granada still whisper the truth. Here ruled a queen who kneeled to God but made kings kneel to her. Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba didn't just resist the Portuguese Empire. She turned the jungles of Angola into her battlefield and the tides of history into her weapon. Born in 1583, she ruled a kingdom under siege, where European slavers carved paths of devastation inland, hungry for human cargo, but Nzinga refused to be a bystander. When Portuguese diplomats demanded her submission, she arrived at negotiations not as a supplicant but as an equal. Legend says she made a servant kneel to serve as her chair, ensuring she'd meet their governor eye to eye. This wasn't just theatrics, it was a declaration. Her kingdom wouldn't bow. What followed was 4 decades of relentless defiance. Nzinga mastered guerrilla warfare, her forces melting into the forests after ambushing Portuguese supply lines. She forged alliances with rival tribes and even the Dutch, playing European powers against each other with the skill of a chess grandmaster. At one point, facing overwhelming odds, she retreated deep into the mountains, rebuilt her army, and retook her capital in a daring night raid. But her brilliance wasn't confined to the battlefield. When the Portuguese captured her sister, Nzinga didn't charge in recklessly. She negotiated her release, then immediately strengthened her borders, proving she knew when to fight and when to outthink her enemies. Yet Nzinga's story exposes a glaring gap in how we frame medieval and early modern history. Why do timelines so often exclude Africa's warrior queens? The answer lies in the narratives we've inherited. European chroniclers dismissed African rulers as savages or exotics, erasing their sophistication. Even today, textbooks segment history into neat boxes. Medieval Europe here, colonial Africa there, as if Nzinga's strategies fortified cities, diplomatic marriages, espionage, weren't echoes of Elina of Aquitaine or Tamar of Georgia. Her resistance wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a global tapestry of women's leadership we've been taught not to see. The heart of her legacy isn't just in the battles she won, but in the system she dismantled. Nzinga turned her kingdom into a sanctuary for escaped slaves, offering them land and protection. She reshaped Matamba's laws to favor maternal lineage, ensuring women's voices couldn't be sidelined. And when she finally signed a peace treaty with Portugal in 1657, it wasn't surrender, it was a stalemate that preserved her people's autonomy for generations. That's why her absence from so many medieval narratives stings. Nzinga forces us to confront the borders we've drawn around history itself. Her battles weren't fought in stone castles but in mangrove swamps. Her crown wasn't gold but woven from resilience. To honor her is to admit that warrior queens didn't just ride under European banners. They thrived wherever power was contested, their stories waiting where we've rarely thought to look. Raidgund of Thuringia's story begins not with a crown but with chains. Torn from her homeland as a child after Frankish armies slaughtered her family, she was paraded as a trophy of war, a princess reduced to a pawn in King Clotaire I's court. But what makes her extraordinary isn't just that she survived, it's how she transformed her suffering into a weapon of peace. Forced into marriage with her captor, Raidgund didn't submit. She turned her royal quarters into a refuge, secretly distributing food to the poor and treating Clotaire's cruelty as fuel for her defiance. When he murdered her last surviving brother, she didn't weep quietly. She walked out of the palace in plain view, straight to the church of Noyon, and demanded sanctuary, an act so brazen it forced the king's hand. This wasn't retreat, it was reinvention. At the monastery she founded in Poitiers, Raidgund wielded a different kind of authority. Her letters to bishops and emperors weren't pleas, they were negotiations. When 2 warring factions threatened to spill blood into her sanctuary, she didn't wait for men to intervene. Clad in her nun's habit, she walked unarmed between the opposing forces, her mere presence halting the violence. This was spiritual warfare, and her armor was her unshakable moral clarity. Even the Byzantine emperor sent her a fragment of the true cross. not as a gift to a humble nun, but as tribute to a woman whose influence stretched across kingdoms. What's often overlooked is how strategic her piety was. Raidgund didn't just pray, she built networks. Her monastery became a hub for political exiles, a place where nobles sent their daughters to be educated and subtly indebted to her. She composed poetry that critiqued the very wars that had shattered her childhood, her words circulating through courts like quiet grenades, and when Clotaire tried to drag her back to court after years of separation. She leveraged her alliance with the church to ensure he never laid hands on her again. Historians struggle to categorize her. Was she a warrior? She never raised a sword. A queen, she renounced her title, yet her legacy pulses through the centuries precisely because she defied labels. In an era when women's power was measured in marriages or military victories, Raidgund proved that true strength could bloom in the soil of resilience, that sometimes the most formidable battles are fought not on fields, but in the quiet spaces between surrender and survival. Fredigund of Neustria didn't climb to power, she clawed. Born a servant in the 6th century Frankish court, she entered history as a footnote in Queen Ordovra's household, a woman with no name, no lineage, and no future. Yet by the time her story ended, she'd rewritten the rules of Frankish politics, outmanustering kings and nobles who never saw her coming. How does a woman with nothing but wit and will topple an empire? By playing a game where mercy was the quickest path to the grave. Her rise began with a calculated gamble. When King Chilperic of Neustria took notice of her, Fredigund didn't just become his mistress, she became his strategist. His queen, Ordovra, was exiled. His next wife, Galswintha, was found strangled in her bed. Chroniclers blamed Fredigund, painting her as a venomous schemer. But consider the world she inhabited. Merovingian Francia was a fractured realm where brothers warred over scraps of land, and queens who couldn't defend their sons' inheritances watched them slaughtered. Fredigund's brutality wasn't senseless, it was survival written in blood. Take her feud with Brunhild, Queen of Austrasia. What began as a rivalry between sisters-in-law spiraled into a 50-year vendetta that shaped Europe. When Brunhild's husband accused Chilperic of killing Galswintha, Fredigund didn't wait for diplomacy. She sent assassins. When Brunhild's son threatened her own boy's claim, she allegedly poisoned him. Each move was a counterstrike in a war where the penalty for weakness was extinction. Even her own daughter's death became a weapon, rumors claim. She staged the girl's murder to frame Brunhild's faction. Yet for all the ink spilled condemning her, Fredigund's reign was startlingly effective. She stabilized Neustria's treasury, reformed its laws, and ensured her son Cloth, II, inherited a kingdom intact, a rarity in an era of fractured successions. Her spies were legendary, her network of informants stretching into enemy courts. When a rebellion erupted, she didn't hide behind palace walls. She rode out, pregnant, to confront the traitors herself, her presence alone quelling the revolt. Here's the thorn history won't let go. Would we remember her differently if she'd been a man? Chroniclers called her Jezebel for tactics that earned kings praise as strong. The same ruthlessness that made Charlemagne a conqueror made Fredigund a monster. But in a world where queens were chess pieces unless they seized the board, her story forces us to ask, is villainy just what we call ambition when it wears a skirt? The answer whispers through the gaps in parchment where her victories and her victims lie tangled like roots beneath a gnarled oak. Olga of Kyiv didn't mourn her husband's death, she weaponized it. When the Drevlians, a neighboring tribe, ambushed and killed Prince Igor in the 10th century, they assumed his widow would be an easy target. They sent messengers offering marriage to their own prince, a move meant to absorb Kiev's lands without a fight. What they got instead was a masterclass in subterfuge. Olga welcomed the envoys with chilling hospitality. "You are tired from your journey. she cooed before having them buried alive in a trench. But this wasn't just vengeance, it was psychological warfare. Her next move, a request for the Drevlians to send their finest men to escort her to their territory. When they arrived, she invited them to bathe in a bathhouse, then locked the doors and burned them alive. Yet Olga's genius lay in her restraint. She didn't stop at brutality. When the time came to confront the Drevlians directly, she besieged their capital, Iskorostan, but instead of storming the gates, she demanded a tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. The citizens, baffled but relieved, complied. What they didn't know was that Olga's soldiers tied burning embers to the birds' feet. Released at night, the panicked creatures flew back to their nests in the thatched roofs of the city, setting Iskorostan ablaze from within. This wasn't just revenge, it was a calculated demonstration of how thoroughly she could outthink her enemies. What's even more striking is the pivot that followed. After securing her son's throne and Kiev's borders, Olga embraced Christianity, becoming one of the first Rus rulers to do so. She traveled to Constantinople, where the Byzantine emperor himself stood as her baptismal sponsor. Suddenly, the woman who'd incinerated her foes was building churches and pleading for clergy to spread the faith. Later chroniclers, eager to claim her as a saint, glossed over her early ruthlessness, framing her conversion as a clean break from violence. But the truth is messier and more fascinating. Olga didn't erase her past, she layered it. Her faith became another tool of statecraft, aligning Kiev with Byzantium's power while distancing her from pagan rivals. The duality of her legacy raises uncomfortable questions. Why do we insist on sanitizing warrior queens into either monsters or angels? Olga's reign proves that medieval women could be both pragmatic and pious, vengeful and visionary. Her story isn't a contradiction, it's a mirror held up to the complexities of power itself. The same hands that lit the fires of Iskorostan also lifted the first cross over Kiev, not in repentance, but as proof that a queen's will could shape the spiritual destiny of a nation. Melisend of Jerusalem ascended to power in a land where holy wars raged and loyalties shifted like desert sands. The daughter of Baldwin II, she wasn't just handed a crown, she inherited a kingdom perpetually on the brink. Crusader Jerusalem was a precarious patchwork of Christian lords, Muslim neighbors, and simmering tensions, where a single misstep could unravel decades of fragile peace. Yet Melisend didn't merely rule, she transformed the city into a beacon of culture and diplomacy, all while navigating a marriage so toxic it nearly cost her the throne. Her political genius revealed itself early. When her father died, he left the kingdom jointly to Melisend, her husband Fulk of Anjou, and their infant son, a move meant to placate nobles wary of a woman's sole rule. But Fulk, a seasoned warrior, saw his wife as a figurehead. He sidelined her, dismissing her allies and filling court positions with his own men. Most queens might have acquiesced. Melisend retaliated by rallying the nobility to her cause. These weren't just loyalists, they were Jerusalem's native barons who resented Fulk's foreign favoritism. The conflict escalated until the streets of Acre teemed with armed factions, and the church intervened to broker a truce. The compromise, Fulk would retain his title, but Melisend's authority was undeniable. She'd turned a civil war into a power-sharing arrangement, one where she held the upper hand. What's often overshadowed is how she wielded soft power. While Crusader kings before her had relied on brute force, Melisend built alliances through patronage and symbolism. She commissioned the stunning Church of St. Anne, a masterpiece of Romanesque architecture that doubled as a political statement. Jerusalem wasn't just a military outpost, it was a cultural capital worthy of respect. Her court became a hub for scholars and artists, a deliberate contrast to the grim austerity of her husband's rule. Even her seals told a story. Unlike other queens depicted in passive poses, Melisend showed her seated on a throne holding a scepter with the inscription, Melisend, by the grace of God, Queen of Jerusalem. But her greatest test came after Fulk's death, when her own son Baldwin III grew impatient for power. At first, she governed as regent, her experience invaluable in negotiating with Muslim leaders like Zengi of Mosul. Yet as Baldwin reached adulthood, he demanded full control. Their rivalry split the kingdom, culminating in a siege where Baldwin's forces besieged her in the Tower of David. Even then, Melisend refused to be toppled. She negotiated a graceful exit, retaining rule over Nablus and continuing to influence state affairs until her death. Why does history remember her more for buildings than battles? Perhaps because her victories weren't the kind that fit neatly into chronicles of crusading glory. Melisend didn't lead charges, but she ensured Jerusalem survived long enough for others to fight. Her reign was a masterclass in balancing piety with pragmatism, proving that in the Holy Land, the sharpest weapon wasn't always a sword. Sometimes it was the ability to make even your enemies see your legitimacy. While kings came and went, her legacy endured in the stones of the city she loved, a silent testament to the queen who ruled not by conquest but by cunning. Sibyla of Jerusalem stepped onto a throne already crumbling beneath her feet. Unlike her formidable grandmother Melisend, who had shaped the kingdom through diplomacy and cultural patronage, Sibyla inherited a realm teetering on collapse. The year was 1186, and Saladin's forces were closing in, their banners darkening the horizon. But the true threat wasn't just the army outside the gate, it was the fractures within her own court. Sibyla's reign is often framed as a tragedy, a footnote in the fall of Jerusalem, but to dismiss her as a passive victim is to miss the brutal constraints she faced and the fleeting moments where her agency flickered through the cracks. Her first challenge was legitimacy itself. Though crowned queen, Sibyla's authority hinged on her marriage to Guy of Lusignan, a man whose military incompetence would become legendary. When nobles urged her to divorce him after his disastrous defeat at the Battle of Hattin, she refused. Chroniclers painted this as blind loyalty, but consider the stakes. Rejecting Guy would have alienated his supporters and splintered what little unity remained. Sibyla wasn't just choosing a husband, she was playing a doomed hand with no winning cards. Even her coronation had been a masterstroke of survival. She convinced the patriarch to anoint Guy separately, ensuring her own sovereignty wasn't erased by matrimony. Then came Saladin's siege. As the city's defenses faltered, Sibyla did something extraordinary. She negotiated. While Guy languished in captivity, she bartered with the Sultan, securing safe passage for Jerusalem's civilians in exchange for surrender. This wasn't cowardice, it was pragmatism in the face of annihilation. Yet history remembers her plea to Saladin as desperation, not diplomacy. Why? Because the scribes of the time and later historians couldn't reconcile a woman's leadership with defeat. When men lost battles, they were unlucky. When women did, it was proof they never belonged on the battlefield to begin with. The cruelest twist came after the fall. Sibyla, exiled to Acre, watched her children die of disease in 1190. With no heirs left, her political relevance evaporated. But in her final months, she staged one last act of defiance. She willed her crown to her sister Isabella, a move that prolonged the Crusader state's survival for another century. Even in ruin, she understood dynastic strategy better than the knights who'd scorned her. Sibyla's story forces us to ask, what does it mean to lead when every choice is catastrophic? Her reign wasn't a failure of will, it was a testament to how narrow the margins were for women in crisis. Where Melisend had built, Sibyla could only salvage. Where Tamar of Georgia conquered, Sibyla negotiated retreats. but to judge her by the same measure is to ignore the avalanche bearing down on her. The truth is, Jerusalem was lost long before she wore the crown. Her tragedy isn't that she fell, it's that we've forgotten how hard she fought to slow the descent. Constance of Sicily took the throne at an age when most medieval women were considered relics, nearly 50, with silver threading her hair and a lifetime of political storms behind her. The kingdom she inherited in 1194 was less a crown than a tangle of knives. German emperors eyed Sicily's wealth, local barons chafed under central rule, and Rome watched, waiting to pounce on any weakness. But Constance wasn't just a placeholder. She was the last scion of the Hauteville dynasty, a lineage of conquerors who'd carved Sicily from chaos, and she had one weapon her enemies underestimated: time. Her first move was sheer audacity. With the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, her husband, campaigning in Germany, rebels swept across the island, declaring Sicily ripe for the taking. Constance didn't wait for rescue. She rallied loyal garrisons, outmaneuvering rebel sieges with a general's eye for terrain. When Henry finally arrived, it wasn't to save her, it was to find the fires already smothered. But her real masterstroke came later. At an age when contemporaries were grandmothers, Constance gave birth to a son, Frederick. In a world where dynasties lived or died on the whim of childbirth, this wasn't just a miracle, it was a political earthquake. Suddenly, the woman critics called barren held the future in her arms. The child became her shield. With Frederick as heir, Constance neutralized rival claims and forced Rome to recognize her authority. Even her age, once a liability, became an asset. While younger queens faced constant pressure to remarry, Constance's maturity lent her an aura of unshakable legitimacy. She didn't need a king's shadow to rule. Her very longevity proved divine favor. Yet her greatest test came at her deathbed. Knowing Henry's German allies might sideline her Sicilian legacy, she drafted a will that named the Pope as Frederick's guardian, a move that seemed like surrender but was actually subterfuge. By tying Rome to her son's fate, she ensured no foreign power could outright steal his birthright. The gamble worked. Frederick would grow up to become Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world, but his mother's fingerprints were all over his rise. What's startling is how Constance's story twists the medieval script. Older women in power were usually depicted as either frail or ruthless. She was neither. Her late motherhood wasn't a vulnerability, it was a calculated reinvention, proof that a queen's body could defy nature's limits and her enemies' expectations. In a single reign, she rewrote what strength looked like, leaving a legacy not of youth but of endurance. Jadwiger of Poland didn't just wear a crown, she shattered its very meaning. At 10 years old, she wasn't merely declared queen. She was crowned Rex, the male title of king, a linguistic sleight of hand that transformed her from a placeholder into a sovereign. This wasn't symbolism, it was strategy. Medieval Poland teetered on a knife's edge, wedged between the Teutonic Knights' crusading zeal and Hungary's expansionist hunger. A girl on the throne should have been a recipe for disaster. Instead, Jadwiger turned her youth and piety into weapons, wielding them with the precision of a seasoned statesman. Take her marriage to Jadwiga of Lithuania, a union often framed as a saintly act of conversion. The truth, it was a geopolitical masterstroke. By binding pagan Lithuania to Christian Poland, she didn't just save souls, she created a buffer against the Teutonic Order's relentless advance. The wedding contract, negotiated when she was barely 12, stipulated that Jadwiga would baptize his people, but it also secured military alliances that would define Eastern Europe for centuries. Yet history remembers her kneeling in prayer more often than she's pictured at the treaty table. Why? Because a queen who builds empires through faith fits a neater narrative than one who calculates the cost of salvation. Even her charity carried a razor's edge. When she donated her jewels to revive Krakow's university, it wasn't just generosity, it was nation-building. The renamed Jagiellonian University became a beacon of learning, attracting scholars who'd later champion Poland's intellectual independence. Her famed wooden crucifix carved deep with her knife in a fit of devotion. A calculated display of humility that endeared her to peasants and nobles alike. Every act of piety doubled as a political maneuver, blurring the line between sacred and strategic. The tragedy of Jadwiger's legacy lies in what we've chosen to emphasize. She died at 25, childbirth stealing a ruler who'd barely begun to shape her realm. But in those fleeting years, she proved holiness and hard power weren't opposites. They could be woven together like threads in a tapestry. Later generations would call her a saint, polishing away the shrewdness that underpinned her sanctity. Yet the stones of Wall Cathedral whisper another truth. Here lies a king who prayed like a queen and ruled like neither, leaving a kingdom far stronger than the girl who inherited it. Elina of Aquitaine rode into the Second Crusade not as a consort, but as a force her silks traded for chainmail, her courtly grace sharpened into command. History remembers her as the queen who shaped kingdoms through marriages and treaties, but the whispers of her military presence linger like campfire tales. Did she truly don armor beside King Louis VII, urging knights onward when morale faltered? Or have centuries of fascination spun a warrior's mantle around a woman already larger than life? The truth, as always, lies somewhere between the chronicles and the longing for heroines who defied their age. Consider the scene, Antioch, 1148. The crusade was unraveling, its leaders fractured by pride and poor strategy. Chroniclers like William of Tyre note Elena's vocal opposition to Louis's plan to march onward, a stance so vehement it sparked rumors of rebellion. Some accounts claim she threatened to dissolve their marriage unless he altered course. Others suggest she took a more active role, rallying Aquitaine's knights under her own banner. The line between advisor and commander blurs here, obscured by the biases of monks who couldn't fathom a woman dictating military policy. But the financial records don't lie. Elina funded knights directly, their loyalty tied to her purse as much as to the cross on their tunics. Then there's the armor. No inventory list survived to confirm she wore it, but the image persists, a queen clad in steel, her presence electrifying the ranks. Perhaps it's not the metal that matters, but the metaphor. In an era when women were barred from battle, Elena's mere proximity to the front lines was a provocation. Her later imprisonment by Henry II for supporting their son's revolt hints at a woman unafraid of conflict, whether waged with words or swords. What's often overlooked is how her legend grew not despite her gender, but because of it. Troubadours embellished her exploits, painting her as a chivalric ideal, a queen who inspired valor without needing to swing a blade herself. Later romancers went further, inventing scenes of her leading charges, but strip away the poetry and you're left with something subtler. A master of perception who understood that power thrives in the stories people tell. Elena's military reputation, then, isn't just about what she did or didn't do on campaign. It's about the space she carved for women in the imagination of an age obsessed with glory. Whether she rode in armor or simply wielded influence with a general's precision, her legacy challenges us to ask why we need our heroines armored in the first place, and what it says when history polishes their swords brighter than their wits. Margaret of Denmark didn't conquer her empire with swords. She stitched it together with treaties, marriages, and a patience that outlasted every rival. By the time she took the throne in 1387, Scandinavia was a fractured mess of feuding kingdoms, each bleeding itself dry in petty squabbles. Yet within a decade, this unassuming queen united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under the Kalmar Union, creating a Nordic powerhouse that stretched from the Baltic to the North Sea. Her secret: she understood that real power wasn't seized in battle. It was built in ledgers and lawbooks, one careful signature at a time. Take her handling of Sweden. When the nobles there rebelled against their unpopular king, Margaret didn't send armies. She sent diplomats, exploiting their discontent to negotiate a personal union that placed her grandnephew Eric on the throne, with herself as the true power behind it. Then came Norway, where she leveraged her son Olaf's claim to the crown, not through war, but through a web of alliances that left her opponents with no viable alternative. Even her enemies marveled at her restraint. While other rulers celebrated victories with parades, Margaret marked hers with trade agreements that bound her new territories together economically, making rebellion too costly to consider. What's striking is how little bloodshed accompanied her rise. Medieval queens who avoided the battlefield often get labeled as mere administrators, their achievements filed away as bureaucratic footnotes. But Margaret's quiet competence was anything but passive. She reformed tax systems to fill royal coffers without sparking revolts, a balancing act few kings managed. She standardized laws across 3 kingdoms, replacing chaos with consistency. And when the Hanseatic League threatened Scandinavia's trade, she didn't rattle sabers, she outnegotiated them, securing Danish control over vital Baltic routes. The irony of her legacy, the very pragmatism that made her successful, also made her forgettable. There's no epic Margaret saga, no dramatic last stand to immortalize her in song. Even the Kalmar Union, her masterpiece, is often credited to the men who followed her. But look closer, and you'll see her fingerprints everywhere. In the treaties that held Scandinavia together for over a century, in the legal frameworks that outlived her, even in the way later queens would cite her reign as proof that patience could be mightier than the sword. Perhaps history overlooks rulers like Margaret because their victories lack the fireworks we crave. But in a world where most medieval women's power was fleeting, hers endured not through force, but through the unglamorous, relentless work of making empire look effortless. The real question isn't why she's forgotten. It's why we insist that only blood-stained crowns are worth remembering. Isabella of France didn't just cross the English Channel in 1326, she shattered the very notion of what a queen could do. Dubbed the She-Wolf by chroniclers who trembled at her audacity, this wasn't a woman content to whisper in corridors or scheme through intermediaries. When her husband, Edward II, proved disastrously inept, favoring corrupt advisors, losing battles, and neglecting his kingdom, Isabella didn't beg or weep. She raised an army, with her lover Roger Mortimer at her side and mercenaries at her back. She landed on England's shores not as a fugitive, but as a conqueror. The invasion was so swift, so ruthlessly efficient, that Edward's own forces melted away rather than face her. Within months, she'd forced his abdication, placing their teenage son on the throne while she and Mortimer ruled as regents. History remembers her as a vengeful wife, but peel back the layers, and you'll find a ruler who understood that sometimes treason is the only path to justice. The brilliance of Isabella's coup lay in its theatricality. She didn't slink into England under cover of darkness. She arrived draped in the symbolism of a savior. Her banners bore the Virgin Mary's image, framing her not as a usurper but as God's instrument, there to purge corruption. When she marched through London, crowds cheered, their loyalty bought not with coins but with promises of reform. She'd spent years in exile, watching Edward's misrule from afar, and now she wielded public outrage like a weapon. Even the nobility, typically wary of female power, rallied to her cause. not because they respected her gender, but because they feared Edward's incompetence more. Isabella's genius was recognizing that rebellion needed legitimacy, and she crafted hers with the precision of a master propagandist. Yet the question lingers, was this betrayal or liberation? Edward's reign had brought England to the brink bankrupt, humiliated by Scotland's Robert the Bruce and rife with favoritism. By removing him, Isabella didn't just avenge personal slights, she stabilized a nation. Her regency saw the expulsion of Edward's hated favorites, the reassertion of royal authority, and the seeds of what would become England's parliamentary evolution. But here's the rub. Her partnership with Mortimer soon mirrored the corruption she'd overthrown. When her son Edward III came of age, he executed Mortimer and sidelined Isabella, a twist that paints a story in shades of grey rather than black and white. What's often overlooked is how Isabella's legacy echoes beyond her reign. Her invasion proved that queens could be more than consorts, they could be kingmakers, even if the crown never officially rested on their heads. Later monarchs, from Elizabeth I to Victoria, would walk the path she blazed, wielding influence through proxies and persuasion. The she-wolf moniker, meant to demonize her, instead captures her ferocity. A woman who refused to be caged, even when the cost was her own reputation. In the end, Isabella's story isn't about a wife's vengeance. It's about the price of power and who gets to decide when a king has failed his people. Katerina Sforza didn't just defend her city. She rewrote the rules of medieval siege warfare with a single, chilling act of defiance. When conspirators murdered her husband, Girolamo Riario, and seized control of Forli in 1488, they made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed the widow would surrender quietly. Instead, Katerina barricaded herself inside the city's fortress with her children, daring the rebels to strike. What happened next became legend. As the mob threatened to execute her captured sons unless she yielded, Katerina strode to the ramparts, hiked up her skirts, and shouted down at them, "Do it. I have the tools to make more." The gamble worked. Stunned by her ruthlessness, the attackers hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, she rallied loyal troops to crush the rebellion. But this wasn't just battlefield bravado. Katerina's threat exposed a brutal truth about power in Renaissance Italy. Sentimentality was a luxury rulers couldn't afford. Her life had taught her that lesson early. Born into Milan's ruthless Sforza dynasty, she'd grown up watching uncles and cousins assassinate rivals without flinching. By the time she ruled Forli, her political playbook included poison, espionage, and preemptive strikes. When the Borgias' first Rodrigo, then his son Cesare, set their sights on her lands, she didn't wait for siege engines to roll in. She stockpiled gunpowder, trained crossbow-wielding women to man the walls, and personally tested new artillery designs. Yet for all her military genius, Katerina's legacy is shadowed by paradox. The same woman who coolly risked her children's lives also penned meticulous letters about their education, fretting over Latin tutors and music lessons. She commissioned lavish portraits that depicted her as both a nurturing mother and an armored warlord, refusing to choose between the roles. Even her famed alchemy experiments, some whispered she brewed poisons as readily as perfumes, reflected this duality. In an age that demanded women be either Madonnas or monsters, Katerina insisted on being both. The cost of that defiance came due when Cesare Borgia finally breached Forli's walls in 1500. Captured and paraded through Rome as a trophy, Katerina might have faded into obscurity, but prison couldn't break her. She negotiated her release, retired to Florence, and spent her final years hosting salons where philosophers debated whether power corrupted women differently than men. Her answer, etched in every chapter of her life, was unmistakable. Corruption wasn't gendered. survival demanded the same ruthlessness from queens as it did from kings. The only difference, history would call her a tigress for deeds that made men legendary. What makes Katerina's story so unsettling isn't her cruelty, it's her clarity. She understood that in Renaissance Italy, mercy often meant martyrdom. Her extremes force us to ask, is a mother who sacrifices her children's safety to save their inheritance a villain or a visionary? The answer lies not in judging her choices, but in recognizing the impossible calculus of power she faced. For every castle she held, there was a line she crossed, and in those crossings, she laid bare the price of sovereignty itself. Zenobia of Palmyra didn't just defy Rome, she rewrote its playbook. In the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire seemed untouchable, this queen of the Syrian desert carved out her own realm, stretching from Egypt to Turkey, and dared to call herself empress. Her story bridges the ancient and medieval worlds, a blueprint for warrior queens who'd follow her. Yet Roman historians buried her legacy, dismissing her as a rebel rather than the ruler she truly was. Why? Because Zenobia's very existence shattered the myth of imperial invincibility. Her rise was as improbable as it was audacious. After her husband Odenathus, Rome's ally in the east, was assassinated, Zenobia didn't retreat into mourning. She seized control of Palmyra's armies and launched a campaign that stunned the Mediterranean. Egypt's grain fields, the lifeblood of Rome, conquered. Roman legions sent to crush her, outmaneuvered in the Syrian sands. She even minted coins bearing her likeness alongside the emperor's, a brazen declaration of equality. But Zenobia wasn't just a warlord. She turned her court into a haven for philosophers and scholars, championing Greek culture while preserving Palmyra's Arab identity. The historian Zosimus described her as more courageous than any man of her time, a ruler who conducted affairs with such skill that she seemed to have been born for command. Rome's eventual retaliation was inevitable. Emperor Aurelian, fresh from reuniting the fractured empire, marched east with one goal: erase Zenobia's insolence from history. The siege of Palmyra was brutal, but what happened next is even more revealing. Captured and paraded through Rome in golden chains, Zenobia didn't crumble. Legends claim she charmed her way into Roman high society, even marrying a senator. Whether true or not, her survival was its own rebellion, a refusal to play the defeated barbarian for Rome's propaganda. Here's the real tragedy of her legacy. While medieval queens like Elina of Aquitaine or Tamar of Georgia drew from her example, Roman historians minimized Zenobia as a fleeting nuisance. The reason: she exposed the empire's fragility. A woman from the desert had humbled Rome, proving its borders weren't sacred. Later chroniclers couldn't reconcile her brilliance with their worldview, so they painted her as a pawn of men or a power-hungry upstart. But the ruins of Palmyra tell another story of a queen who walked like Caesar, ruled like Cleopatra, and dared to dream an empire of her own. Her shadow stretches far beyond the Syrian sands, whispering to every woman who's ever been told her ambitions were too vast. Gudit of Ethiopia emerges from the fog of history like a storm cloud, dark, powerful, and impossible to ignore, even if we can't quite see her shape. The stories say she swept into the ancient kingdom of Axum like a wildfire, toppling obelisks, burning churches, and ending a dynasty that traced its roots to King Solomon himself. But here's the haunting question: was Gudit a conqueror, a liberator, or a phantom conjured by later chroniclers to explain an empire's collapse? Unlike queens like Tamar or Æthelflæd, whose deeds are etched in stone and parchment, Gudit's legacy is written in smoke. The few clues we have are tantalizing. Arab traders wrote of a Yodit or Asoto, meaning fire, who ruled over parts of Ethiopia in the 10th century. Local oral traditions describe a fierce queen who rejected Christianity and restored indigenous beliefs, her reign marking a violent break from Aksum's past. But the most chilling account comes from the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's sacred text, which paints her as a usurper who slaughtered princes and left the land in ruins. Yet for all these fragments, there's no archaeological trail, no inscriptions bearing her name, no coins minted under her rule. It's as if the earth itself swallowed her footsteps. This absence has fueled centuries of debate. Some scholars argue Gudit was a rebel leader, perhaps from the Agor people, rising against Aksum's Christian elite. Others speculate she was a foreign invader, a Jewish queen from the distant kingdom of Semyon, though evidence is thin. And then there's the possibility she never existed at all, that Gudit is a shadow puppet, a scapegoat for droughts, dynastic strife, or even an earthquake that weakened Aksum before its fall. What makes her story so gripping isn't just the mystery, but what it reveals about history's blind spots. When empires crumble, someone must be blamed. And when that someone is a woman who defies religious and political norms, her legend grows fangs. Gudit's tale mirrors other dark queen myths, like the Viking sagas of wicked sorceresses or the Byzantine whispers about Irene of Athens, where women in power become monsters if they challenge the status quo. Yet there's another way to read Gudit, not as a destroyer but as a disruptor. If she truly did dismantle Aksum's power structures, might she have been purging corruption, not civilization? Without her side of the story, we're left with echoes. Even her supposed atrocities like burning churches mirror the tactics of male conquerors who were later glorified. The difference, their violence was framed as divine will, hers as heresy. The real tragedy of Gudit isn't that she might have been erased, it's that we'll never know how much more there was to erase. Her name lingers like an unanswered riddle, a reminder that history isn't just written by the victors, but by those who decide which victors deserve to be remembered. And in that silence, Gudit's greatest power emerges, the ability to make us question everything we think we know about who holds the pen. Tomo Gozen rides through Japanese history like a lightning strike, brilliant, fleeting, and impossible to ignore. The Hike Monogatari, Japan's Great War epic, paints her as the ultimate female samurai, a warrior so skilled she could wield a naginata with the grace of a dancer and the lethality of a storm. In the brutal Genpei War of the 12th century, where the Minamoto and Terra clans tore the country apart, Tomo fought alongside her lord, Kaizo Yoshinoka, her long hair streaming beneath her helmet as she cut down enemies with terrifying precision. The tales claim she took heads as trophies, led charges that shattered enemy lines, and was the last to flee a losing battle, only because Yoshinoka ordered her to survive. But here's the twist, no contemporary records mention her. So was Tomo Gozen a flesh and blood warrior, or a legend crafted to defy Japan's rigid gender norms? The debate over her existence reveals how cultures preserve or erase women's battlefield roles. Medieval Japan's samurai class prized masculinity, with Bushido codes later codifying women's place as caretakers, not combatants. Yet dig deeper, and you'll find hints that women like Tomo weren't anomalies. Anamusha female warriors appear in scattered accounts. Hojo Masako, who commanded armies after her husband's death, or Hangoku Gozen, another Genpei War figure who defended forts with a bow. Tomo's legend might be an amalgamation of these women, their deeds distilled into one iconic figure. The Hike Monogatari, written decades after the war, blends history and folklore, leaving scholars to sift poetry for kernels of truth. What's undeniable is Tomo's cultural resonance. For centuries, she's been a paradox, a woman celebrated for violent prowess in a society that idealized feminine quietude. Kabuki plays and ukiyo-e prints immortalized her, often emphasizing her beauty alongside her brutality, as if audiences needed the reminder that she was still desirable despite her skill. Even her alleged fate is layered with symbolism. Some versions say she retired to a nunnery. Others claim she vanished after beheading a rival samurai, her final act of defiance. These conflicting endings reflect Japan's unease with women who stepped outside tradition, admired but only at a safe distance. Tomo's legacy forces us to confront how myths become history. Whether real or imagined, she endures because she answers a need, proof that women have always been more than the roles assigned to them. In a modern world where female soldiers still fight for recognition, her story, however embellished, is a sword thrust through the heart of forgetfulness. The question isn't just, did Tomo Gozen exist? It's, why do we need her to have existed? And that answer is written in every girl who's ever picked up a wooden sword and dreamed of being unstoppable. Raisia Sultana of Delhi didn't just break the glass ceiling, she shattered it with the edge of her sword. In 1236, this daughter of Sultan Iltutmish became the first and only woman to rule the Delhi Sultanate, a realm stretching across northern India. But her father's decision to name her heir wasn't just progressive, it was explosive. The nobles, accustomed to bows and beards in the throne room, balked at the idea of a woman commanding them. Raisia's response: she traded her veils for chainmail, addressed her court in male attire, and took the title Sultan, refusing the softer Sultana. This wasn't just symbolism, it was a declaration that her authority wouldn't be softened for comfort. Her reign began with promise. Raisia appointed ministers based on merit, not bloodline, a radical move in a world where power was inherited like family silver. She inspected troops on horseback, her presence alone silencing whispers of weakness. Even her coins bore her name without apology, a silent rebellion stamped into every transaction. But her most audacious act was her relationship with Jamal ad-Din Yaqut, an Abyssinian slave turned advisor. The nobles sneered at their closeness, spreading rumors that Yaqut influenced her rule. Was their outrage genuine concern or disgust that a woman dared choose her own confidant, especially one outside their elite circles? The rebellion came swiftly. Led by the same nobles who'd bristled at her reforms, the revolt wasn't just about Yaqut, it was about control. Raisia fought back, riding into battle at the head of her army, but betrayal ran deep. Captured and imprisoned, she escaped, only to die in a skirmish with bandits. Her reign lasted barely 4 years, a flicker of defiance snuffed out too soon. Historians still debate her downfall. Was it her gender, her reforms, or simply the cutthroat politics of medieval Delhi? The chronicler Minhaj I-Siraj, who knew her personally, praised her courage but lamented that sovereignty never sits well with women. Yet Raisia's real failure wasn't her skill, it was her refusal to play the game by its rigged rules. She trusted competence over cronyism, love over alliances, and paid the price. Her legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. Today, school children in India learn her name, but often as a tragic figure, not the visionary she was. The truth, Raisia wasn't defeated because she was a woman. She was defeated because she was a woman who refused to pretend otherwise. In a world where queens often ruled through husbands or sons, she demanded the throne on her own terms, and for that, history still struggles to forgive her. Maria of Antioch arrived in the Holy Land not as a conqueror, but as a bride, yet she would leave it as one of the Crusader state's most tenacious defenders. Married to the much older Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos as part of a fragile alliance, she was widowed by her mid-30s, her young son Bohemond III suddenly heir to Antioch's unstable throne. What followed wasn't just a regency, but a masterclass in political survival. While chroniclers of the time fixated on knights and battles, Maria waged a quieter war against scheming barons who saw her son's minority as their chance to seize power, against rival crusader states eager to absorb Antioch's lands, and even against her own kin in Constantinople who saw her as a pawn to reclaim. Her first test came when the nobleman Raidgund of Chatillon, fresh from his own disastrous imprisonment in Aleppo, returned to Antioch and demanded control of the regency. Where others might have surrendered to his battlefield reputation, Maria countered with legal precision. She produced documents proving her sole right to rule until Bohemond came of age, then fortified the city against Raidgund's supporters. When whispers spread that a woman couldn't command loyalty in wartime, she proved them wrong by personally negotiating an alliance with the Knights Templar, their swords securing her son's birthright. Yet Maria's true struggle wasn't just against men, it was against time. Every day her son remained a child was another day factions could plot, so she turned Antioch's court into a school of statecraft, tutoring Bohemond in the arts her Byzantine upbringing had taught her: how to read a treaty for hidden traps, how to flatter a rival into compliance, when to show mercy and when to strike. Her greatest victory came not on a battlefield, but in a throne room when 15-year-old Bohemond officially took power and immediately confirmed her as his chief advisor. Here lies the cruel irony of Maria's legacy. Though she safeguarded Antioch through its most vulnerable years, history barely murmurs her name. Part of this erasure stems from medieval biases scribes preferred to chronicle kings and knights, not the women who shaped them. But there's a deeper pattern at work. Mothers in power are often framed as placeholders, their authority temporary by nature. We see it with Blanche of Castile guiding young Louis IX of France, or with Maria Theresa securing her son's future in Austria. Their brilliance dimmed by the assumption that maternal rule is inherently transitional. Maria's story forces us to ask, why do we dismiss the architects in favor of the heirs they raised? Her reign wasn't an interlude, it was the foundation upon which Antioch's survival rested. The treaties she brokered, the alliances she nurtured, even the lessons she etched into her son's mind, all outlasted her. Perhaps that's the real discomfort her critics couldn't voice. Not that a woman ruled, but that she ruled so well it made the men around her seem dispensable. Philippa of Hainault stood on the rain-slicked walls of Calais in 1347, her gaze fixed not on the enemy beyond the gates, but on the 6 men kneeling in the mud below. These weren't soldiers, they were burghers, the town's wealthiest citizens, barefoot and noosed like common criminals. Her husband, Edward III, had vowed to hang them as punishment for Calais' stubborn resistance during the siege of the 100 Years' War. But Philippa saw what the king, in his fury, could not. Victory wasn't just about breaking wills, it was about winning hearts. With her heavily pregnant belly leading the way, she walked into history, not with a sword, but with a plea that would redefine the power of mercy in wartime. This moment reveals the double-edged nature of medieval queenship. While warrior queens like Tamar and Æthelflæd secured their legacies through conquest, Philippa wielded a different kind of authority, one rooted in the moral leverage uniquely afforded to women of her station. Edward's threat to execute the burghers wasn't just cruelty, it was theater, a calculated display of dominance meant to terrify other rebellious towns. Philippa's intervention, staged as a spontaneous act of maternal compassion, was equally strategic. By publicly begging for the men's lives, she allowed Edward to grant clemency without appearing weak, preserving his reputation while softening his rule. The chronicler Jean Froissart, who immortalized the scene, captured the brilliance of her maneuver. The queen wept so tenderly it would have melted stone. But those tears were anything but naive. What's often overlooked is how Philippa's influence extended far beyond this single act. As Edward's most trusted advisor, she managed England's finances during his frequent campaigns, ensuring troops were paid and supply lines intact, a logistical feat as critical as any battlefield victory. When Scottish forces invaded in 1346, she didn't retreat to safety. She rallied northern defences in Edward's absence, her letters to sheriffs and mayors blending maternal warmth with steely resolve. "Fail not in your duty," she wrote, "lest the realm suffer for it." Even her famed patronage of scholars and poets served a political end. By fostering a cultural renaissance at court, she crafted an image of English sophistication that outshone France's, turning soft power into a weapon of prestige. Yet the burghers of Calais scene endures because it exposes a paradox. Medieval chroniclers celebrated Philippa's feminine virtues, her piety, her tenderness, while quietly downplaying her administrative and political acumen. The same woman who brokered peace with Scotland and stabilized England's economy is remembered chiefly for kneeling in the mud. This selective memory speaks volumes about how history filters women's power through gendered expectations. Philippa's compassion wasn't weakness, it was diplomacy in another form, proof that queens could shape outcomes not just through force, but through the calculated performance of empathy. Her legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. The 6 burghers, immortalized in Rodin sculpture, stand forever frozen in gratitude, but the real monument is the precedent she set. In an age where queens were expected to birth heirs and bless banners, Philippa proved they could also rewrite the rules of mercy, turning what looked like submission into a subtler kind of sovereignty. The lesson: sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword, but the hand that stays its swing. Anne of Beaujeu didn't just hold France together, she rebuilt it from the wreckage of war with the precision of a master architect. When her father, Louis XI, died in 1483, the kingdom was a tinderbox of rebellious nobles and bankrupt coffers. Her brother Charles VIII was just 13, his crown more a target than a guarantee. Enter Anne, a woman so politically astute that diplomats called her the least foolish woman in Europe, a backhanded compliment masking their awe. For 8 years as regent, she ruled with an iron grip wrapped in velvet, proving that the quietest moves often wield the sharpest consequences. Her first challenge was the Mad War, a revolt by France's most powerful lords who smelled weakness in a boy king. Anne didn't just crush them, she dismantled their power structure brick by brick. Take the Duke of Orleans, the rebellion's ringleader. Instead of executing him and creating a martyr, she imprisoned him, then systematically stripped his allies of lands and titles through legal maneuvers so meticulous they left no room for counterattack. When the Duke of Brittany tried to exploit the chaos by allying with foreign powers, Anne countered with a marriage treaty that would later pull Brittany into France's orbit, a long game played with the patience of a spider. What's startling is how she weaponized perception. While male rulers flaunted their authority through public displays of force, Anne operated through calculated silence. She penned letters in her brother's name, her influence invisible but undeniable. She cultivated a network of spies so vast that one ambassador joked even the palace mice reported to her. Yet her most enduring tool was her salon, where poets and philosophers mingled with diplomats. In an era when intellectualism was seen as a masculine pursuit, Anne turned her court into a theater of soft power, where ideas were currency and every conversation was a potential chess move. The tragedy of her legacy lies in its erasure. Later historians, dazzled by the flamboyance of Catherine de' Medici or the valor of Joan of Arc, dismissed Anne as a mere placeholder. But the evidence screams otherwise. She drafted the Pragmatic Sanction, curbing papal influence in France, a reform so bold it foreshadowed the Reformation. She negotiated the Treaty of Æthelflæd, securing peace with England on terms so favorable it funded France's Renaissance. Even her enemies admitted her genius. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian once grumbled that she outkinged the kings. So why does realpolitik lack glamour? Because Anne's victories didn't come with epic last stands or torrid scandals. They came in ledgers and treaties, in the slow unspooling of influence that doesn't fit neatly into ballads. Her reign whispers an uncomfortable truth. The most transformative power often works in shadows, leaving no statues but shaping the very ground they might stand on. While others chased glory, Anne built a foundation, and France's golden age walked in her footsteps without ever saying her name. Isabella of Portugal didn't just keep the throne warm for her husband. She ruled Spain with the sharpness of a sword and the precision of a scribe's quill. When Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, left to wage wars across Europe, he didn't hand his queen the reins as a courtesy. He entrusted her with an empire on the brink. Rebellious nobles, bankrupt treasuries, and the ever-looming threat of Ottoman expansion. These were the battles Isabella fought, not on horseback, but in council chambers and correspondence. Her weapon, a mind that could outmaneuver generals without ever drawing a blade. Take the revolt of the Comuneros, a wildfire of dissent that threatened to consume Castile. While Charles was bogged down in Germany, nobles and townsfolk alike revolted against his absentee rule, demanding local autonomy and lower taxes. Isabella didn't panic. She didn't wait for her husband's orders. Instead, she deployed a dual strategy, crushing the rebellion's military leaders with swift, brutal force, while simultaneously offering pardons to rank-and-file rebels who laid down their arms. This wasn't just compromise, it was psychological warfare. By splitting the movement, she weakened its resolve, then sealed the victory by reforming the very grievances that sparked the uprising. Tax policies were adjusted, local councils granted measured freedoms. The message was clear: cross her and face consequences, cooperate and find an ally. But Isabella's genius wasn't confined to crisis management. She redefined Spain's administrative backbone, streamlining chaotic bureaucracies into something resembling modern governance. Her court became a hub of innovation, where she championed early banking reforms and trade agreements that stabilized the economy. Diplomats marveled at her ability to negotiate with rival powers like Portugal and England, securing treaties that expanded Spanish influence without a single battle. Even her personal letters reveal a ruler who micromanaged with staggering detail, ordering audits, demanding supply reports from distant colonies, and mediating disputes between bishops and merchants with equal authority. What's often overlooked is how she weaponized her image. While warrior queens like Joan of Arc or Katerina Sforza leaned into martial symbolism, Isabella embraced the trappings of maternal care. She commissioned portraits depicting her surrounded by her children, a visual shorthand that framed her rule as an extension of motherhood, protecting, nurturing, but never weak. It was a masterstroke of propaganda, disarming critics who might otherwise have balked at a woman's firm grip on power. Yet for all her triumphs, Isabella's legacy suffers from a cruel irony. Because she ruled in her husband's name, history often credits Charles for the stability she built. His victories on foreign battlefields overshadow her victories at home, where the real foundation of Spain's golden age was laid. The truth: without Isabella's deft hand, Charles's empire might have crumbled before it ever reached its zenith. Her war wasn't fought with pikes and cannons, but with ink, diplomacy, and an unshakable will to hold the line. And in that quieter, relentless struggle, she proved that the sharpest swords aren't always made of steel. Across the tapestry of medieval history, these warrior queens wove strikingly similar patterns, each thread revealing how women navigated systems designed to exclude them. Strategic marriages weren't just alliances, they were Trojan horses. When Matilda of Tuscany wedded to secure political cover, or when Margaret of Denmark orchestrated dynastic unions to bind Scandinavia, they transformed matrimony from a cage into a crowbar, prying open doors to power. But the true genius lay in their mastery of symbolism. Tamar of Georgia didn't just commission churches, she filled their frescoes with her own image, flanked by saints, forcing subjects to literally worship her authority. Æthelflæd rebuilt fortresses not merely as defenses, but as physical manifestations of her unyielding will, stone sermons preaching her right to rule. Yet their most subversive weapon was exploiting loopholes in the very systems meant to suppress them. When society declared women couldn't lead armies, Katerina Sforza armed her ladies-in-waiting with crossbows and called them a guard detail. When the church insisted queens should be pious, Jadwiger of Poland weaponized her sanctity to justify military campaigns. Even their supposed weaknesses became strengths. Pregnancy, often seen as vulnerability, became Philippa of Hainault's most powerful bargaining chip, her swollen belly a visual plea for mercy that disarmed opponents more effectively than any sword. The erasure of these rulers from mainstream history wasn't passive neglect, it was active censorship. Monastic chroniclers, the medieval world's journalists, faced an existential crisis when documenting women like Elina of Aquitaine or Fredigund. How could they reconcile biblical notions of female submission with queens who commanded armies and toppled kings? The solution was either to vilify them as unnatural monsters or to diminish their roles into footnotes. Sibyla of Jerusalem's desperate negotiations with Saladin became hysterical pleas, while Isabella of France's brilliant coup was reduced to a wife's revenge. The few who escaped caricature, like Olga of Kyiv, were sanitized. Her conversion to Christianity emphasized over the cunning brutality that secured her throne. What unites them across time and geography is their collective demolition of the passive medieval woman archetype. These weren't exceptions to the rule, they were proof that the rule was a myth. From the icy fjords where Margaret of Denmark outmaneuvered warlords to the sweltering deserts where Nzinga of Ndongo outwitted empires, they operated by the same ruthless calculus as male rulers. They just faced higher stakes and harsher judgment. Their legacy isn't merely a handful of remarkable biographies. It's a challenge to re-examine every assumption about who shaped the medieval world. The real question isn't why so few women rose to power, but how so many triumphed despite the machinery grinding against them, and why we've been so determined to forget. These 26 queens shatter the myth that the medieval world was a stage for men alone. Their stories, long dismissed as footnotes, force us to rewrite the narrative entirely. Think of history as a grand tapestry, and for centuries half its threads were snipped away, leaving gaps we mistook for the whole picture. These women weren't anomalies, they were the rule we've been taught to ignore. From Æthelflæd's fortified towns to Nzinga's guerrilla warfare, their strategies mirrored the finest military minds of their age. When Tamar of Georgia minted coins with her title king, or when Katerina Sforza stared down rebels from the ramparts, they weren't borrowing power, they were redefining it. What's most revealing isn't just their triumphs, but the sheer diversity of their tactics. Some, like Isabella of France, wielded raw force, while others, like Margaret of Denmark, stitched empires together with treaties and trade. Raidgund turned a nun's habit into armor, and Gudit's legend, whether fact or fabrication, proves how fiercely cultures resist erasure. Their stories collapse the lazy dichotomy between warrior and queen, revealing a spectrum of leadership as varied as the lands they ruled. The common thread, an unshakable refusal to let biology dictate destiny. Yet their erasure wasn't accidental. Chroniclers faced a dilemma: how to document women who broke every mold. The solution was to distort or diminish, to frame Melisend's diplomacy as maternal instinct or Sibylla's surrender as hysteria. Even today, we struggle to reconcile their complexity. We sanitize Jadwiger's political savvy into sainthood, or reduce Fredigund's survival instincts to villainy. But history isn't a morality play. These women were ruthless, pious, cunning, and compassionate, often all at once. To flatten them into heroines or monsters is to miss the point entirely. So where do we go from here? Start by questioning whose names are missing. For every Matilda or Zenobia we've rediscovered, countless others linger in the shadows. African queens like Amina of Zaria, Southeast Asian rulers like Tribhuwana of Majapahit, or indigenous leaders like Lozen of the Apache. The work isn't just to remember them, but to dismantle the systems that buried them. Share your favorites below whose story shocked or inspired you. And if you're hungry for more hidden histories, hit subscribe. The past is vast, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface.